is the Honorable Dr. Brad Wenstrup, Select Committee Chairman. And Brad Wenstrup, Congressman, welcome again to the Bill Cunningham Show. And some are complaining that you and Jim Jordan are going too slow. I watched, it was either Tucker Carlson or Sean Hannity a few nights ago, and I said, wait a minute, it's been less than 60 days. Give them some time. So what is the purpose of your subcommittee, and what do you hope to learn about, which is going to be the truth?
Well, in the big picture, this subcommittee is a huge after-action review and lessons learned of everything that's happened in the last 3 years, and some even before that, and to create a better path forward and have us ready. And in some ways, I say what I hope to do at the end is produce a product that will enable us to predict, prepare for, protect ourselves from, and prevent a pandemic if we can. We're going to be looking at the responses, how it affected us economically. We're going to look at vaccines and treatments. We're going to look at the roles of our agencies, the effects of the lockdowns, the effects on education, our supply chain. What kind of data we're really collecting through all this scientific data, which is, as a physician, it's extremely important, and we did a horrible job of it. Did we really record adverse reactions very well to the vaccines, and were we relating it to physicians? But obviously, one of the big ones that everyone has interest in, especially me, I sit on Intelligence Committee, and I've been studying the origins of COVID since the very beginning. In some ways, I found out about it accidentally, because when the pandemic started and we were locked down, I started doing research with another doctor, and we were finding all kinds of things from open source. Like in 2012, Anthony Fauci came out and was talking about gain-of-function research, or creation of a chimera, where you take two viruses and then create one that's more infectious. And he, I think, felt at that time that if we can do this and create a vaccine for it, then there's nothing we can't cure. And he was even asked, well, aren't you worried about it getting out of lab and creating a pandemic? And he said, no, I think the benefits outweigh the risks. But look, he was sending the money out from NIH to places like EcoHealth Alliance, and that were then working with the Chinese in their lab in Wuhan to work with coronaviruses. They're going to be doing a lot of denying. And you mentioned a second ago, Bill, about conspiracies. I mean, I've had enough of it. And as I'm taking on this position, liberal media and that keep talking about Republicans, you're not going to come up with more conspiracy theories, are you? And as I said on one interview today, it's like you called the lab leak a conspiracy theory, and now we have what appears to be two agencies coming out saying it does look like the lab, which I have felt for some time, because too many of the breadcrumbs go towards the lab. And a lot of that information is classified. I hope we can declassify it at some time. I do think the market may very well have been the first super spreader. But you also have to look at other things, Bill. In 2005, our own State Department said that the Chinese were looking at bioweapons, and in 2015 they wrote about genetic weapons from their Academy of Military Medical Science. So they've been looking at this type of stuff for some time. And in 2015 is when the article was published between the U.S. and the China about the creation of a chimera. But, through all this, we put out a memo today, just as we're starting to unravel things that we can put out publicly. And some of this information comes from things we got in 2021, some we got last month, some we got through Freedom of Information Act, some open source. But let me just take you through some things that really have not been out in the public.
Okay.
Some of this has. January 31st of 20, Kristen Anderson emails Fauci and says, this thing looks engineered. Now, these are the scientists involved. Yet 3 days later, they get together and they said, we're going to have to get together and write a paper. We're going to call it Proximal Origins. And it's also been noted in some of the documents where they said that this was prompted, those are their words, prompted by Dr. Farrar, Dr. Fauci, and Dr. Collins. Now, that's on February 4th, they start this process. On February 8th, Anderson is now known, and it's in the documents, to have said that he is spending his time focusing on disproving the lab theory. Why?
Why?
Yeah, exactly. Well, we need to get to those motives, right?
Well,
April.
Yeah, go ahead. Please go ahead. I'm going to ask you this question. As an American sitting back, I want to know where it came from. Now, why does official Washington, and this began with the Trump administration and it was metastasized under Biden, why is it a term of art to say it came from a wet market and not from the lab? Is it because we funded a lot of the research to create the COVID-19? Is it because too many business interests want to blame a wet bat in a cave and not Virology Wuhan Institute? What is the motivation not to tell us the truth going back almost 3 years? What's the reason not to tell us the truth?
Well, I'll take you right up to that point in about a minute and a half.
Okay.
But I'll finish what I was saying.
Please.
So April of 20, Collins emails Fauci and says that the proximal origins paper that they came out with that said it came from nature didn't do enough to put down the lab theory. And so Fauci goes out on the White House lawn, says it came from nature, and they were basing it on, they found a sequence in a pangolin that was consistent with what is in the sequences of COVID-19. All right, so that's where they say, oh, look, it's consistent with some of the sequences in nature. Well, they never found any animal in nature that had COVID-19. But at the same time, and this is important, at the same time as they're saying this to the public, privately, they're saying there's no evidence that this pangolin sequence is related to COVID-19 at all, or the pangolin coronaviruses. So Fauci comes out and says it. So what happens June 1st? Daszak sends an email to Fauci saying, thank you so much for coming out and saying it came from nature. Now, who's Daszak? He's with EcoHealth Alliance. He's getting NIH grants, and then we're doing coronavirus research in China. What's the motive?
Yeah.
Well, I think Marty McCary said it pretty well. Dr. Marty McCary, the roundtable our committee had last week, and he said, I believe that, and I'm paraphrasing here, that if we had not been doing research in China of this type, there's probably no one in America that would be thinking that this came from anywhere but the lab in China.
Sure.
And I think that's logical. But here you have people, if you are responsible for creating a virus that went on to kill hundreds of thousands of people across the globe, wouldn't you possibly have some motive to want to say that it didn't come from you? No way, it had to come from nature.
So going back to 2012, Fauci said gain of function research, we're going to try to do the union of these two strains, and once we have a super way of dealing with it, no matter what happens in the future, we'll be able to deal with it. The intention may have been good, but when it turned out to backfire, the American people do not know that we funded the creation of COVID-19. And the American people, we partially did them, and when they were caught red-handed, Fauci, Collins, et al. Worked hard, and the media certainly played right in with them to attack anyone, especially Marty McCary and many others, who said we have to look at the Wuhan virology lab because the outbreak started right there. The odds are all around the world, right next to this lab doing research on gain of function, that suddenly just next to it we had the outbreak of this coronavirus. I mean that's shocking, the idea of these two things, and we can't let the American people know that we funded it, that we knew about it. We better cover it up. Is this a massive cover-up, Congressman Brad Wenstrup? Is this the cover-up by Dr. Fauci et al.?
Well, I think I know there was one scientist who was looking at all this early on. I can't remember who it was because I've read so many names through the last 3 years. But I remember him saying, I don't know if it came from the lab, but I sure as heck think there's a cover-up. And so that's what we have to get to the bottom of. And we're also feel very concerned about the public health response.
Sure.
Look, at the very beginning, this thing's called novel for a reason. Nobody knows anything about it. We're looking for ways to try and treat people that get it. And sadly, we didn't have anything. We didn't have tests for it. We didn't understand it. There was just so much to learn. The real question is, as you start to learn, did you make corrections on the decisions? So we want to get back to the very beginning. Let's talk about the 2-week lockdown. I will tell you at the time, it seemed to me to make sense. And probably it still did. but it wasn't a 2-year lockdown. It was a 2-week lockdown.
Right.
And certainly as we learned more, who was at risk? We put our elderly at risk by just basically ignoring them and not protecting them when they were the ones most vulnerable. And to be very honest about who's most vulnerable and start to reveal to everybody with sound data that certain age groups, if you don't have any comorbidities, you're probably fine. And we weren't doing these types of things. And now you still turn on the TV and you got people telling you have to have a booster or you should go get a booster. And, you know, Bill, I got the Pfizer vaccine. And I will say this, too. This is not a vaccine like measles, mumps, rubella, and I encourage people to still get their children vaccinated for those things. But now we have programs in place that if your child isn't vaccinated with the mRNA vaccine, then they can't participate in Head Start. This is craziness. These kids are not at risk. Maybe there's some out there that are, that might have leukemia, whatever the case may be. But we are just doing things that make no sense, and Americans aren't stupid. And so the trust is gone, and we got to quit making these types of mistakes and let people know the truth about what's going on and make decisions. So I got the Pfizer vaccine. That was in January of 20. In August, I got COVID, and the only reason I knew is because I couldn't smell garlic salt. And I didn't get tested because I remember about a week before I had a chill. All right, so now they tell me if you want to go to Germany for this conference, you got to get boosted. I said, well, let's check my antibodies and T cells. Well, the lab on the Capitol couldn't do T cells, but they could do antibodies. Well, a strong number was 40. Bill, my number was 821. No doctor would sit with a patient and say, you've got to have a booster, because you don't have any evidence that says that's going to make a difference.
So natural immunity, once you have it, is much better than getting the booster shots. Children, healthy children, are not at risk. Older folks are. We continue to play the game. I recently took an airplane flight. About 1/3 of the people on the plane had a mask on. Everyone that talks about a mask, the research indicates right now, it's completely ineffective. It is virtue signaling with no medical benefit whatsoever. So you're the chair of the committee, and you don't have a defined result. You want to take it wherever the breadcrumbs leave you. Number one, after action report. Number two, government action. What happened? Number three, who made money off this deal or not? And number four, the big thing is, how do we stop future outbreaks of greater viruses that could have more fatalities involved? And that is your main purpose, to find out what happened. And secondly, the next time this occurs, will we be ready for that?
You summed it up very well. And look, I also have a concern, whether it's the soldier in me and serving on intelligence committee. But look, we know our State Department said in 2005 that China has an interest in creating bioweapons. We know that they have what's called the Fifth Institute, which exists for studying coronaviruses and bioweapons. They wrote on it in 2015. They put a book out about genetic weapons like this. So why would we not be concerned about the origins of COVID and what may be going on in China?
Well, one female Chinese doctor said that this was purposefully released, that the Chinese knew exactly what they were doing. They don't care about losing a couple million of their own citizens, and they purposely released this to infect the world, and the next one's going to be worse. Is that a good possibility? You may find that out.
Well, we're going to dig into it, and I certainly have those concerns. That was one of my thoughts early on. Like, well, from what we know about China and their human rights abuses, and if you're not a benefit to the state, we don't necessarily need you. They limit how many children you can have, and they did that to a fault. And now they're encouraging people to have more children. But I don't think that they have, in their type of system, much need for the elderly and the vulnerable, and those that can't produce for the state or for the party. And so I can see where someone might lead themselves to think that, but I don't have any proof of that. But those are the types of things I'd love to have proof of. And I don't know if we'll ever get it, because so much of that is locked or destroyed with inside China.
They have no respect for human dignity, human life. I'm talking about the Chinese leadership, not the Chinese people. The Chinese people are put upon by their leadership, which are communists, and they're brutal dictators and mass murderers. And the idea that the old needs to be dispensed with is something Xi Jinping would do in a heartbeat. And so I know more than a few minority voices have said what transpired with COVID-19 has been a benefit to the CCP. Is that true?
Yeah. Well, I want to say I thank you for pointing one thing out. We're talking about the CCP, not
right.
China itself, not
right.
the Chinese people. We're talking about the CCP.
Right.
That would follow along with that type of thinking, that it would be a benefit to them, right? Because less people to carry along if they're not able to be productive.
Congressman Dr. Brad Wenstrup, the select committee work continues, and I hope the media covers it more in the future than they've covered this in the past, and maybe cover it objectively. That would be impossible from their perspective. But Brad Wenstrup, once again, thank you for coming on the Bill Cunningham Show, and with your permission, we'll do it again.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill.
Congressman Dr. Brad Wenstrup on the Intelligence